Okay, good evening. This is the LaRouche Pack Monday strategic discussion. We're going to do a little inversion, so I'll kind of get the call started with a brief introduction, and then bring in Keisha Rogers for kind of an overview of what we touched on last week, which is a rapid rate of breakthroughs in the space exploration area, which are not just more, satellite deployments and various curiosities in terms of scientific investigations, but are the very kind of meat and bones of what's going to be required to sustain a higher level of economy and human participation in the space economy, on the moon, on Mars, permanent human presence, industrial activity, robotic activity, educational capabilities, scientific research. So there's been a lot that's been happening, from James Webb Space Telescope, which opens up new horizons on the origins of the universe and philosophical and cosmological questions, the Lawrence Livermore breakthroughs. We touched on it last week, and Keisha and I both thought it would be very useful if she developed that a little bit more tonight. But before we do, I want to just introduce people to a couple of things. First is on our website, we have a new feature. So at the top of the LaRouche Pack website, we have About Us, Get Active, Content, authors, and so on. Sometimes these things aren't the easiest way to navigate, but we've added our campaigns, one of which is Abolish the Federal Reserve, which, if you're feeling pressure at the gas pump or when you buy a carton of eggs, this is the inflationary beast right here, and it's out of control, and things are probably going to get worse, and we'll touch on that. You've also got Project Prometheus. This is the LaRouche Pack unique coherence on how we drive the kinds of scientific and technological discussions that we're going to have tonight as an economic agenda. 100, if not 1,000 new nuclear power plants, fusion research, space research, and to build up a workforce, a cadre of engineers and scientists, and really drive the 21st century economy. But the new element is know your enemy. And this is, you'll see it down here, chapter 4. This gets at the new series from Barbara Boyd, a true crime story and lesson for our times. This is input, in essence, input to the new Jordan Committee, the new investigation, an echo of the Pike and Church committees of the 1970s that were targeted by the Bush family and Bush faction, the Bushies, as we've called them, inside essentially the deep state, that have targeted both the check on the intelligence community and targeted both our organization and, among others, also very specifically, President Trump. So it includes this. It also includes updates on people like Ron DeSantis, the Bush family specifically, and you'll see more on this as this process develops. Just a real quick note, a true crime story is really a way of understanding, if you haven't looked at this series yet, of understanding the unique intervention that LaRouche and his organization made in the 1970s and 80s, which is perhaps the greatest intellectual insurgency into the dominant political power on the planet in human history. It echoes much like what Plato did during the collapse of Athens. But LaRouche recognized a capability to advance. One of those elements, besides facing direct opposition from this deep state, Kissinger, Rockefeller, Bush network, was also LaRouche's proffering of the SDI, new science and technology, fusion energy agenda, which passed Congress in the early 1980s. The SDI project, which was a missile defense program, has now been referenced by President Trump multiple times in his announcement in December when he launched that he will run for president, again in a video posted last week, and then again in South Carolina as he kicked off his campaign there in that state. So this will give you a sense, this series will give you a sense of how the fights we waged then help educate how we can wage the fight today and how we can win it dealing with this intelligence community deep state operation, and we intend to deploy this material directly into the Jordan Committee. So on that, let me just review very briefly that we are looking at an escalation of a certain level of insanity from the West. I'll just give you a quick indication. This comes out of the Itar Tass news agency out of Russia. But apparently Tobias Ellwood, who is the chairman of the British Parliament's Defense Committee, called on the British government to get ready for a direct standoff between the UK and Russia and to increase defense spending. Now, it doesn't have quotes, so what exactly he said is unclear. But we know that the German defense minister said that we are at war with Russia at a recent kind of call to action and basically call to arms of the European Parliament for funding for weapons for Ukraine. And we're apparently sending M1 Abrams tanks, though that may be 3 or 6 months from actually happening. It may have been just a stunt in some sense to force Germany's hand with their Leopard 2 tanks. The point is, what are these woke, white-collar fanatics thinking? Have they no capacity to understand the outcome of their actions, the effect of their actions, or have they become so stupefied, so woke, so drugged, so brainwashed, and also just so desperate that they can no longer see any other pathway to impose their hegemony of this neoliberal world order than to basically push us into the brink of nuclear war? That very well may be the case, but there is a growing opposition and resistance to that. And a bigger problem, and something that was unique always to Mr. LaRouche's assessment, was the looming economic crisis, where inflation, if you feel it at the gas pump, is already going up. Food prices, and they're now talking, are wages going to be coming down? There's massive layoffs all over Silicon Valley, as we've reported before. That's not the only sector. We can expect it in the financial sector, in media in general. And you can't run an economy on a police state. Ask East Germany, ask the French, you ask, Tsarist Russia. You can't build up and run an economy off of a police state. It doesn't function. But to lose this war in Ukraine, to expose the bankruptcy of U.S. foreign policy over the last 20 or 30 years, really inaugurated by Bush with both the globalization agenda and the war in Iraq, we are looking at an exposure, a nakedness of the emperor, you might say. He has no clothes. He has no longer any legitimacy. But that's the neoliberal regime. There is real legitimacy in the people of our nation, the people of Europe, and the people of every nation, especially if they're deployed around the kind of scientific mission that Keisha is going to develop a little bit more tonight. So on that note, let me hand it off to Keisha for more discussion, and then we'll come back with your thoughts, questions, and insights so that we're prepared for a very active and intense week. Oh, let me just note very briefly, Trump, of course, as many of you know, really got his campaign into gear, and this will certainly be, what Keisha will touch on tonight, is certainly an expression of the Trump effect of his first term, and why we want to make sure we consolidate a second one. So Keisha, on that note, I'll hand it off to you.
All right, absolutely. So we are absolutely excited that President Trump did announce his campaign, not only announced, got it kicked off with the campaign event that just took place in New Hampshire and in South Carolina, and we'll be talking about that a little bit more. And I think it goes right to the point of what I want to bring into the discussion of what has now culminated in a major breakthrough for our nation and for humanity as we go further into space with the unveiling of some exciting new projects around nuclear power, nuclear propulsion systems. And this wouldn't really be possible without the vision and without the leadership that President Trump put forth when he was in office through his mission for the Artemis program. The Artemis program Trump set forth for returning American astronauts to the moon and developing the platform for long-term presence on the moon and going to Mars. And with the Artemis mission to return American astronauts to the moon for the first time in 50 years, the goal he set for 2024. Now, during President Trump's administration, that was made possible and really took off with the signing of Space Policy Directive 1 for putting into place the Artemis program and a return of human astronauts or American astronauts to the moon, and also later on with the signing of Space Policy Directive 6. And I talk about this in an article that I just wrote. Hopefully Michael will have a chance to put it up. The title of the article is Nuclear Rockets Forging a Path to New Space Frontiers. And so what just happened with the recent conference that took place between that was held by the AIAA, the American Institute for Aeronautics and Astronautics, that took place, and where the announcement of NASA and DARPA joining together to do further tests on nuclear rockets that hadn't been done or really hadn't had the breakthrough that it did over this past week in terms of this level of cooperation and advanced work on nuclear thermal propulsion systems since the 1960s. So people might remember something called the NERVA program, that we were testing nuclear rocket capabilities during the Apollo mission. So under President Trump, and this is obviously transcended administrations, and there's still work being done under the current administration. And I think that this is critically important because before I tell you a little bit more about the details of the project there, which you can find in the article that I wrote, I think it is, I mean, obviously we can say under the Biden-Harris administration, under the Biden collective, there's really nothing good that's coming out of this administration. But one thing is that what Trump set into motion with the advancement of the Artemis program and with the commitment to restore nuclear propulsion systems and systems for nuclear fission on the moon and for Earth really set the stage in terms of making this a priority that could not be stopped. And so I think what we saw in terms of the advancements of the nuclear thermal propulsion systems and the idea that if we're going to send human beings to Mars, that's the objective. That was the objective under President Trump also, which is that you actually have to build what Lyndon LaRouche understood as a platform of development. So the question starts with, you have to develop your capabilities in low Earth orbit. So one of the programs that DARPA has been looking at, and DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. It was already working on projects for nuclear thermal propulsion. And just so I can clarify nuclear, so the difference, people are used to chemical rockets, traditional chemical rockets. We went to the moon with the traditional chemical rockets during the Apollo program, Saturn V. And the challenge has always been, well, these rockets use a lot of fuel, they use a lot of thrust, and they're very low efficient in terms of being able to have the type of efficiency to get to another planetary body like Mars in an effective and efficient amount of time using less fuel, less propulsion. So So one thing in terms of some of the work that's been ongoing and really has now started to develop more now than it has in the past years, in terms of 50 years ago, that was the last time we really saw real investments and advancements in nuclear thermal propulsion, nuclear electric propulsion. And I'll talk about that in just a second. But the basic difference is that you would have, with nuclear thermal propulsion, that you would have about 2 times the ISP, or the specific impulse, the thrust developed. And so you would, with the chemical rocket, you have about 450 pounds of thrust, where with the nuclear thermal propulsion, how it works in terms of the fact that you use a fission system to heat up a hydrogen propellant, and then that hydrogen propellant is expelled out of the back, or out of a nozzle that creates thrust for the rocket to propel forward. And so this gives a much higher thrust, and it allows you to be able to create an energy or a thrust in terms of your propelling the rocket forward that would get you to your destination much faster, because you're using get you to your destination much faster because you're using a propulsion system that is higher in efficiency. So now, obviously, there's a number of things that are going on right now in terms of looking at not just nuclear thermal propulsion systems, but looking at what's called bimodal systems, which, if you look at the article that I wrote, there's some research that is going on with that right now, which would combine nuclear electric propulsion and nuclear thermal propulsion. And this would basically increase your ISPs, your propulsion to thrust rate enormously. And you would go up to about 4,000 ISP versus with the chemical rocket, 400, 450 ISP. And now that's just the start. But I think as what we're seeing in terms of these developments is that you have a commitment that's coming from NASA, coming from DARPA, to achieve a goal, which is not just going to be how do we build more efficient rockets. Obviously, the efficiency of these rockets is going to determine how we propel human beings into space safely when we're dealing with things like radiation in space, when we're dealing with the fact that we would have to learn how to develop the mission to go to Mars without having to wait every 2 years for the time frame for the rotation between the Earth, for the Earth and Mars to wait on the Hohmann effect for getting to Mars. But this would allow us to be able to get there in efficient time, to be able to save our astronauts from having to go through the very strong effects of radiation, that you could get there in 40, some people are saying 45 days with certain systems, to 100 days, depending on how we actually are able to utilize this new breakthrough in the research in terms of the new developments in nuclear thermal propulsion and nuclear electric propulsion systems, combining those systems, bimodal systems. But it also, what we're talking about is you're going to have a totally new advancement in your manufacturing, your workforce. We're not just talking about more efficient rockets and launching American astronauts to Mars and getting them there in a month's time or a month and a half's time. But we're also talking about developing the resources, developing the capabilities, the technologies, both here on Earth through what DARPA is going to be able to do, NASA, also our commercial and industry partners and leaders as well, which is, I think, the most important part. And this is something that what Trump understood and continues to understand. And this is something that I would say Lyndon LaRouche, as we're talking here on the LaRouche Political Action Committee, really recognized that there was something quite fascinating that was on the verge of coming from the Trump presidency as he was going into his presidency with the election in 2016. That what we'll discuss a little bit more here in the context of this call is the fact that not only has Trump continued to put his commitment to ending the endless wars, has called for a program, has called for putting an end to the conflict and war that's ongoing right now between Russia and Ukraine. And he was doing this going into his presidency in 2016. And LaRouche saw this and said it in interviews, particularly in an interview with a very close confidant of President Trump at the time, or then candidate Trump at the time. And I think it's extremely important because Trump was saying that he was opposed to these endless wars and has continued to be opposed to them. And because of him, humanity was saved. And those were the words of Lyndon LaRouche in terms of stopping the threat of nuclear war at the time because of Trump coming into the presidency. Now, this I don't think was coincidental, but LaRouche recognized that what has propelled our nation forward, the advancement of scientific missions, of a science driver mission orientation, has been the commitment of Lyndon LaRouche, has been something that Trump really picked up on in terms of if you're going to have nations, the United States as a leader in scientific and technological progress, we have to advance in nuclear power, in fusion power systems. And so one of the things that we can look at from this program, in terms of what NASA has been commissioned to do if we're going to successfully fulfill the Artemis mission and totally develop the full capabilities of lunar settlements, base camps, and that's being recognized in a number of ways, along with, or in addition to, should I say, the developments in terms of what the capabilities for testing what's called the Draco demonstration rocket for Agile Cislunar Operations Program. This is what DARPA's been working on for a very long time, a demonstration nuclear propulsion system for cislunar space, low Earth orbit. It's advancing with its program with NASA, but this is obviously recognized, it's being recognized by NASA as the key to a mission to fulfill our mission in terms of not only utilizing the resources on the moon, which would be important for what we recognized before for developing rocket fuel, helium-3. And so we're talking about fission systems right now, but then we are very much on the verge of, if we succeed in this mission, going into the type of developments in terms of how we increase our capabilities for Mars missions through later through fusion rocket systems, thermonuclear fusion rocket systems. And this is where our sights need to be set, because if we actually take up what's needed in terms of the capabilities to develop resources, materials on the moon, such as helium-3, then we would be able to use that in terms of propelling us to Mars. But as I said, the way you're going to be able to develop those capabilities is that we actually have to have what Trump called for, making the United States a manufacturing superpower, to put all of our industries, our manufacturing capabilities to work in developing these new technologies and this new research here on Earth. For example, we have a company by the name of BWXT that's working to develop the fuel systems for nuclear systems. And for example, during the NERVA program, we used high enriched uranium with the Draco demonstration or rocket demonstration missions that DARPA and now NASA and DARPA together are working on, are going to be for high SA, low enriched uranium system, or what's called HALEU fuel, which is going to be a more efficient fuel system for nuclear capabilities, which is extremely important. So I think if you think about this in terms of building out a, say, generational mission, 20, 25 years, we're talking about obviously demonstrations that are going to be going on. We're going to be testing this nuclear thermal capability or rocket engine system within the next few years in terms of 2026, 2027. NASA has actually just announced that it did a test on a test demonstration on a new rocket engine using a detonation system. And so that is using supersonic combustions through detonation, and was successful at Marshall Space Flight Center in that mission. We are also looking at, very fascinating developments around by 2025. We want to send what's called a Lucy Night, a astronomy mission to the far side of the moon, and this will be able to be able to detect frequencies in our universe that's not going to be blocked by the radioactivity coming from Earth. And this is very important in terms of getting missions on the far side of the moon, but also what NASA is doing in terms of development of the lunar poles, and where we're going to be really catalyzing, should I say, our programs for the Artemis missions, for when we send our astronauts there for long-term presence and building settlements, and they'll have few nuclear fission systems for surface power and the exploration of the lunar surface. So this is extremely important. I think that the fact that President Trump has announced his campaign and has launched it fully, going to the first states that are going to be the leading states in the upcoming primary elections for the 2024 presidential election. But the fact that he is calling out the globalists, saying we're going to put the end to this system of globalism put into the Bush Rhino apparatus. And I think as we have been emphasizing, the idea that we launch a full offensive in terms of an American system economic development program that's going to be based on the highest advancements of scientific and technological progress is extremely important. And that this is something Trump truly understood during his campaign. And I bring this forward honestly because I have to say, at the conference, when I heard one of the conference that I listened to for the announcement of the work being done between NASA and DARPA, which is extremely exciting, one of the people said, well, the Space Policy Directive 6 got us to this point and was very important for what's being launched with these new developments in terms of the work on nuclear thermal propulsion. And this came from the White House, but wouldn't give credit to the fact that this was because of the very important work that was done by President Trump re-announcing this mission. And as said, you can't do a mission of this type without going through a generation succession of presidencies, but it does require leadership. And I think that we're on the verge of something very remarkable if we put an end to the war policy, put an end to the destructive green agenda, the globalist agenda, and that we put a major focus on this type of manufacturing, science driver, mission orientation. And so there's a lot that's going on right now. I think I'm going to leave it at that, and I can, take some questions. But as far as, when you think about the fact that when we make the breakthrough in terms of figuring out and putting the type of investments into this type of science and research in terms of nuclear fission propulsion systems, but and to know that if we had fusion systems and the idea that we could create an impulse into a specific impulse, a thrust level up to 30 times, 130,000 ISP. And I mean, I know those are just numbers to people, but we're talking about efficiency, and in terms of our getting the types of breakthroughs that are needed, that will allow for humanity not to be held back. So pretty exciting, and I want to hear what you guys have to say. We'll get to further discussion or questions that you might have.